Welcome back. This is week 10, lecture 2, with the title being John Calvin and the French. I think I mentioned last lecture that this week, week 10, is rather odd because there's a real division between lecture 1 and lecture 2. If I had divided this course into distinct parts, which if you look at how it's organized, you could certainly see distinct parts therein, starting off with the Reformation in the later Middle Ages, then Luther's Reformation and Reform in the Empire. Would be section 2, which we just kind of completed with lecture 1 of week 10. This would be the first lecture of part 3, I guess it would be, Patterns of Reformation. Because we're talking here about, I'll mention this a little bit more shortly, a second generation Reformation movements. Not the first generation, but the second generation. First generation is Luther, somewhat Zwingli, but with Calvin, it's really part of the second generation. And I'll explain more of what I mean by that when we get there. And it is the beginning of 3 lectures on Calvin and his movement in France and Geneva. I'll later come back to the French Wars of Religion, they're so called, which would be in part 4, kind of outcomes, so to speak. And so this lecture begins a new segment on patterns. And if you will look to at your final exam, asking about the Reformation, whether it was a revolution or not, I give the stipulations of also discussing different patterns of Reformation. So you just can't talk about Luther and Luther's movement, but you will also need to talk about Calvin and the Radical Reformation and the English Reformation and the Counter Reformation, basically, in terms of answering that question. Because again, the question is based on the course material and how well you grasp and analyze and apply the course material as such to the given problem. So that's kind of this thing. I just want to make sure you know that this is part of that patterns of Reformation. Now, why am I spending 3 lectures on Calvin in Geneva in France, whereas I basically only a single lecture on the other patterns, so to speak? That's because Calvin and Calvinism can be argued, I think, with a lot of legitimacy, has had more impact on the development of quote unquote the West than has Luther. We'll see that later on too. I can point simply to the influence of Calvinism in England, which led to the Puritans, which led to the United States, and on we go. And there'll be other aspects. I'll talk about that too later on in this lecture and the next lecture. And so in terms of the impact of Calvin and Calvinism, and we'll see that there's a big distinction there, just like there is between Luther and Lutheranism, between Augustine and Augustinianism, between Thomas, St. Thomas Aquinas, and Thomism. Between every ism is almost a perversion of the thoughts and ideals and perspectives and positions of the so-called, originator from which the ism stems. But that's another issue that we won't be getting into further today. I just want to kind of set the overall stage, so to speak, for today and what we're doing. And that is turning to France and looking at the major reformer coming out of France, so to speak, John Calvin, or Jean Calvin in French. My French pronunciation is horrible, so I'm not going to burden with you with even trying that, but it's John Calvin in English. But it's difficult because he was very much a Frenchman, and we'll see that again and again. So that's why just Jean Calvin is important to keep in mind to emphasize that Frenchness of Calvin, even when he's in the Swiss city of Geneva. Okay, so that being said, let's look at France and what was going on in the early years, so to speak, before Calvin really appears on the scene. And for that, we have to look to reform circles in France. We have humanism and reform in humanism, um, as it was in Wittenberg, as it was a European phenomenon, not only in Italy, but going north of the Alps, getting into the German universities and also into the French universities, including Paris. This idea that we need to focus on the languages of antiquity, the classical languages of Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, north of the Alps, and that we need to bring our understanding of Christian doctrine and Christian life more in accord with the more authentic texts of the Bible, because the Bible too is the basis for it all. So that approach became the basis. I think I've referred to it before. At least some scholars have referred to it as Christian humanism, but that is really problematic because it certainly was not that humanism in Italy was not Christian. It was also Christian humanism in that sense, but it was the humanist program applied to biblical studies, church reform, and theology. I also, I think, mentioned Erasmus of Rotterdam, known as the Prince of the Humanists, his debates with Luther and everything else. Well, Erasmus was really an international figure at this time in terms of throughout Christendom, throughout the remnants of Christendom as it was crumbling and falling apart. Um, and he knew all the leading reformers. And there was this whole party that was all for reform. And some of Luther's earliest supporters were all for making things better within the church, getting rid of some of the abuses, reforming it along humanist lines, but they did not want to break from Rome. They did not want to go that far. And Erasmus was one of those. We talk about the Erasmianism, which you could say in some ways, depending on what position from where you're coming from, or the interpreter's coming from. Let's say Erasmus was very much kind of sitting on the fence. He tried to have a foot in both camps, so to speak. He did not want to break from Rome. He did not want to claim that the papacy was the throne of Antichrist. Um, but he certainly argued that a lot needed to be done. He wrote an anonymous satirical pamphlet called Julius Exclusus, Julius Excluded, that was very popular and made a lot circulated widely. And the Julius that was excluded was Pope Julius II. So it's not that Erasmus was against criticizing the papacy. Of course, he did so anonymously, even if everyone knew who had written this pamphlet, this treatise. And it's the exclusion part is being excluded from heaven. In essence, Pope Julius dies, goes up to meet St. Peter, and St. Peter says, "What are you doing here? You don't belong here. You're going to hell." And so that's the kind of the point, of this humanist reform. It went to a very large extent, or great extent, to say there's a lot of problems that we need to address and fix. It was for, let's say, almost a radical amelioration of the situation, but not a reformation of the situation. And that is a major issue and distinction. But the point here is that humanist ideas, humanist programs were becoming more popular in France, and they were centered usually at individual cities. It would be groups that would form. I think I mentioned this somewhat with Staupitz and his work talking about Luther, that he was the head of one of these reform-minded humanist groups. And there were also bishops in France who led them. And at the city of Meaux, I have here the Circle of Meaux, um, was one of these reform humanist circles where they would get together, discuss humanist programs, discuss how do we go about reforming the church, what's really needed to be done. It was very much a group of elites, of educated, highly educated elites, talking about what can we do to make things better. And at Meaux, it was led by Bishop Brissonnet. And I just have up here a map on the next slide to show you where Meaux is. It's just slightly northeast of Paris. And it's not a great map, but you can see there's just the A is where Meaux is. There's not an actual little dot with the label of the town. But you can see Paris there. I hope you can find Paris there. It's on the upper third, just slightly to the right of this direct line through the center. If you find Paris and just go up and see the little A bubble, that is where Mo resided. Now, not only was this humanist circle supported by bishops at times, not exclusively, but often, it was also had a lot of support from Margaret of Navarre. Now, Margaret of Navarre was one of these amazing women. A good friend of mine, a colleague, wrote his dissertation on Marguerite of Navarre. Marguerite. She was the sister of King Francis I of France. They were fairly close. And Marguerite was almost like the center of this network. And that's my friend and colleague Jonathan Reed argued in his dissertation that became a book. This network of reform circles in France. She supported Brissonnet and his reform circle at Meaux. She supported other reform groups and almost acted as the linchpin keeping all these together. Again, she was not advocating breaking from Rome, but to how to make things better, how to reform the situation that we found ourselves in. And she was really the king, and she had a lot of authority because she was the king's sister. Now, these reform ideas, these humanist reform ideas, were also present in Paris. And that context is where we then meet up with Calvin, because Paris was probably the earliest context of his development as a scholar, and then eventually breaking and becoming a reformer. And certainly not all of Paris. Paris, as you know, was the seat. I think you know. If you don't, it's probably my fault. I didn't point it out well enough. But in the medieval universities, Paris was really the center of theological studies. And you could also study at Oxford. That became a very prominent place to study theology. But Paris was far and above the most important, just like Bologna was for law. It was well known, well established, very traditional in many ways. I think I've talked about some of that before. And in Paris at the university, there were certainly factions that were very influenced by humanism and wanting to reform the university, wanting to reform the curriculum. There certainly was resistance by a number of different colleges of the university. College of Montaigu, for example, was very conservative and opposed to the humanist reform, but they were very rigorous in their academics. So it was kind of a mixed bag. I think I mentioned too, with Wittenberg, there was, Reformation in one context meant reformation of the university curriculum that Luther supported and that Melanchthon became part of. So that's kind of the situation we have in Paris going on here in the course of the 1520s. And so interest in humanist curricula, trying to reform the university, and that is kind of where we find Calvin. Because Calvin took his Master's of Arts degree in Paris. As I already said, he was French. He was born in Noyon, which is slightly northwest, I believe it is, of Paris. I'd have to go back and look. Now, I put up here, you have the slide, the basic Calvin in Paris, from scholar to reformer. I have up here a timeline. And this is just to emphasize the extent to which Calvin was a second-generation reformer. On the right, as you're looking at this slide, basic timeline, you'll see some of the major dates and developments with Luther and Wittenberg. And then on the left, Calvin and his life and what he was going through. Now, I've talked about, I think, all of the points under Luther and Wittenberg in previous lectures. With Calvin, there's a number of here that I will be getting to and talking more about in this lecture and then following lecture. And a couple I won't say much more about, but we'll get there when we see. But Calvin was born, that you see in Noyon, in 1509, which is the same year that Luther began theological studies. Luther's works were being introduced to France. They weren't completely excluded. They were kind of smuggled in at times. They were being translated into French. Some of these reform circles were doing that, and also translating the Bible. There was some early French translations of the Bible on biblical scholarship too, and and attempts to um, get the word out. I mean, here I'm stumbling a bit because I just said that, but some of the same ideas of translating the Bible into good French, based on humanist models of reform. And this kind of program, and also some of Luther's works, not all of them, but a few of Luther's works were coming in and translated in French. They knew it was suspect because it had been condemned by the Pope. They weren't supposed to be reading Luther. So sometimes they even did it clandestinely, without attribution when translated in French, and hope that people wouldn't really notice. So there's this attempt to read this clandestine literature because they're interested in reform. They know what's going on in the empire, at least somewhat. They're aware of some of the developments, and they want to find out more about it. That's kind of what's going on there. That was very much taking place with these humanist circles. In 1523, I have up there, under Calvin's birth date, is Bishop Brisonnet, who was, as I just said, the leader of the Reform Humanist Circle of Meaux, issued a decree against Luther and his works. Now, of course, this didn't really have much effect. It was mostly a way to demonstrate that he's not a heretic, that he himself, Brisonnet, is not a heretic, and to say, wait a minute, what we're doing here is not what Luther is doing or has done. And so we are going to condemn his Luther and his works, even as we're reading them clandestinely. So it's very much a way of trying to say, look, I'm a bishop. I'm, have my priorities straight. So I'm going to come out and condemn this, or at least issue a proclamation against it, even as we're already being kind of like, let's go back and read it to find out what he's really saying in French, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of that aspect, but it shows too that there is, by 1523, the need to do that. There is the need for Brisonnet to try to distance himself from what was going on in the empire. And in 1525, the Estates General, or the Parliament, the French Parliament or legislature, just as the German Reichstag is the legislature or parliament of the empire. In France, it's the Estates General. In 1525, they accused the group of Meaux of heresy. That accusation didn't go all that far, and Brisonnet was very uh, uh, prescient almost in terms of his decree against Luther in 1523, because he could come out and say, "Look, no, I'm not a Lutheran. I'm not a Lutheran at all. I've already condemned Luther." So this accusation against Meaux by the legislature was simply the legislature saying, "There are some problems here. We think and feel." And Brisson is saying, yeah, kind of prove it. So that's this tension. Again, it's more tension. All the while, I should say, Francis I as king didn't really care. He was too busy with dealing with his wars with Charles V, which I mentioned from the other side of it. Francis was, scheming and plotting. He was being captured a couple of times, by Charles and then let go. I think I mentioned some of that before. He eventually would make a deal with Suleiman the Magnificent, the leader of the Turk, against Charles, which also caused Charles utter shock. How could a fellow Christian prince make ally with the infidel against a Christian prince? And Charles, that was one of the things that blew Charles' mind, as much as the Pope supporting Francis against Charles, which also blew Charles' mind. That's Charles's story. Francis' story and French story is that in some ways, just as Charles was the last medieval emperor, I think I already mentioned, Francis was the first early modern monarch, as I would say. He was very much concerned first and foremost with what is good for France. What is good for me, but what is good for me is good for France, and vice versa. And we see here really the beginnings of this concept of the nation state. More important than religion, more important than alliances, is France. Now, it's only incipient, it's only in early stages, etc. But it's beginning to be there over time. And by the end of this course, we'll see that this concept of the nation state, and what I would refer to as the myth of the nation state, is what replaced the myth of Christendom. And we see it kind of early here with Francis and his policies and attitudes against Charles, against the Turk, and everything else. And he's not saying the Turk is right. He's just saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, so to speak. That was his kind of approach. Now, so it's not an issue of toleration. It's not an issue of acceptance. It's saying, if I can make an agreement with Suleiman, okay, fine, we can get rid of Charles. That's so he's busy with these kind of international issues, and he could care less about the religious dispute. He knows his sister well. He just lets her do her thing. Says, as long as it doesn't bother me, I don't really concern about it. It's almost like benign neglect was his religious policy, was Francis's religious policy at the time. But the legislature, the Estates General, was more concerned. And already, not only in 1525 did they accuse Mo of heresy, but they also then burned three evangelical preachers, condemned for heresy, and they burned them at the stake as heretics in 1525. And again, burning heretics, as we'll see more about this, was a matter of the state. It was never a matter of the church. It was always a matter of the state. The church would condemn the heresy, proclaim people as heretics, but then it was the state who would put them to death for heresy because it was a crime against the state, going all the way back to Rome. And Theodosius proclaiming Christianity the only legal religion of the Roman Empire in 391. From that point on, not to be a Christian was a crime against the state. And during the Middle Ages, there were very few burnings at all. This is really, this begins sort of in the later Middle Ages. They begin to, more people being burned. I talked about the Council of Constance, I believe, when Hus was burned, and they dug up Wycliffe's bones and burned his bones for good measure. So it's almost a phenomenon that is starting to catch on, so to speak. And putting heretics to death was not simply a quote unquote Catholic view, it was also a Protestant view that we'll see later on, I think, in the next lecture as well. Anyway, just like peasants, just like rebellious peasants, the Catholics and Protestants could agree on that very well. No, not allowed. And some of the radicals, as I'll be talking about later, the radical people in the radical Reformation, both Catholics and Protestants would say, absolutely not, these are not allowed, these are heretics, and we need to do something about them. But I'll be talking more about that in a later lecture. Now, I'm not going to be coming back to these burnings. But I just want to point out this is about the climate that Calvin found himself in, because he goes to Paris to study for his master's degree, for a Master of Arts degree, as he always had. And he goes there. I forget exactly when he first goes to Paris. In 1523 or so. I mean, he's pretty young, as they were. I mean, he receives his MA there. It says Calvin receives his MA in 1528 when he's 18 years old. So he was there at least probably by 1523 as this was going on, as the preachers were burned in Paris. And if we look on the other side, we see already in 1525, that's the same date as the Peasants' War. And when we realize that all hell is breaking loose within the empire in 1525, the Estates General in Paris is worried. We don't want that kind of unrest, that kind of rebellion to happen here, so we have to start knocking it down. That was behind the burnings in Paris in 1525. They know what's going on in the empire, at least what they hear. By this time, obviously, Luther had been excommunicated. He had been whisked off to the Wartburg, and then he returns to the Wartburg and the Peasants' War, and then they're getting ready for the Colloquy of Marburg, which I've talked about. And this is the time that Calvin is becoming a Master of Arts. He's a young kid. He gets his MA in 1518. He's a brilliant student. And that's one thing about Calvin. You may love him or hate him. And probably, I would say, with very good reasons for both extremes. But you cannot claim he wasn't absolutely brilliant. I'll be talking more about that next week's lectures and talking about his institutes and so. He had a brilliant mind, without question. And he was an outstanding student. And his love was for the classics. But his father, just like Luther's father, wanted him to study law. That was the way to go. Certainly don't study theology and don't bother yourself with the classics and further humanist studies, um, because also there was no such thing as a doctorate in classics at this time. He might have, if he had stayed in Paris, he might have started studying theology, but he didn't. Calvin never studied theology. He never had a theological degree. He received a law degree. His father wanted him to study law, so Calvin leaves Paris in 1528, and he goes to the University of Orleans, or Orleans, as you see up there. Again, keeping the French pronunciation, Orleans, to study law. And then after a couple of years, he moves on to Bourges, University of Bourges, and completes his legal studies there and receives his law degree from Bourges in 1532. On the timeline there, I have Louis de Bourquin burned for heresy in Paris in 1529. Within that tense context, again, it was the States General who did that, and the only reason I named Louis de Bourquin is because we know the name. He was a very prominent humanist reformer um, in Paris, and he was burned in 1529. So it's already a very tense situation. And Calvin, though, had left already in 1528 to go study law. And he receives his law degree in 1532, but then it's like his father had died, actually, during that time. So he returns to Paris to study classics. As I said, there was no doctorate in classics at this time, but just to be in that context with other like-minded scholars who are studying the classics, who are these humanist, reformed-minded individuals who are looking to classical studies, both in terms of the Greek and Latin authors, but also for the Bible. Even though this was not Calvin's primary interest at the time, the Bible was certainly not. It was with the classical authors, particularly the Roman, that he was most interested in. And in 1532, too, after he returns to Paris, he publishes his first work, which was a commentary on Seneca's, the Roman author Seneca's treatise on clemency, De Clementia. And it's been published, it's been edited. It probably has been translated. I have a copy of the edition in my office, but it's a very interesting work. I mean, it's very much an example of what classical scholarship was at the time. Now, theologians and church historians and just regular historians too have looked to Calvin's commentary on clemency to try to find early signs of a reform mindedness or an evangelical teachings or doctrines. Um, it's not really there. You'd have to more read into it. I mean, just like clemency can be seen as mercy, and mercy certainly is a Christian value and ideal. Clemency is too, primarily. Um, at least always used to be, anyway. But it's not exclusively so. So just because Calvin is talking about being merciful and offering clemency to people does not mean he's doing that in a Christian sense. That's what Seneca is talking about, and Calvin is just expositing on that and expounding on it, and maybe applying it to it somewhat in his time. But it's an excellent um, classical commentary, and that's what Calvin was publishing, and therefore beginning to get known. Now, I have up there Calvin's conversion, 1533 to 34. That's something I'll come back to. And then the Cop affair, which is I'll certainly come back to in just a moment. November 1st, 1533, the Fair of the Placards I'll be talking about shortly. 1534, Calvin flees Paris to go to Basel in 1534. And it's in Basel that he writes the first edition of a work that would be having a massive impact. And in 1536, he publishes it under the title The Institute of the Christian Religion. That is something that I'll be talking about. I have a whole lecture on it for next week. We're talking more about it. Also, the distinction between the singular institute and, as it is more commonly known as, the institutes of the Christian religion. I'll be talking about that later. Um, but as you see, and also that's why I put this timeline up for you, because when you compare what's going on, Calvin, if he, I'll come back to the conversion issue, but with his conversion, 1533-34, that's already as the Civil War and the Empire, the Schmalkaldic Wars, are really going. There is open armed conflict in the empire, and Calvin is just having his conversion experience and just beginning to enter the fray, so to speak. So when we talk about a second generation reformer, that's really what we're getting at, meaning the Reformation and its impact and what it was doing in the empire had already been going for a while, had developed um, very far, and was still working on things, as Calvin is just beginning to say, you know what, something's really going on here. Maybe I will join up, so to speak. But we'll get to that in a second. So that's when I say second generation, which is not my term. Um, that's what we're talking about. That it's not coming from nothing; it's coming with influences already there from Zwingli and Luther, the whole bit. A new pattern, a second generational pattern of Reformation is what Calvin ended up leading. I'm not going to say initiating, but leading. So there we have this, and then we come back to a couple of these points here, a couple of points later on. The next slide then is the same as the one before the timeline, Calvin in Paris, from scholar to reformer, which we've seen in the timeline, that kind of development. Law degree, returned to Paris um, to study the classics, and then he had a conversion experience. We know very little about Calvin as a person from Calvin's own words about himself, whereas Luther talks about himself all the time. He's very free and open. We have the table talks, which I've mentioned numerous times already. Student notes when he's sitting around the table and they're all running down the student notes. We have nothing like that from Calvin. Calvin was very private. And he even says in his commentary on Timothy later on, I only rarely and reluctantly speak of myself. I don't openly do so. So he doesn't talk about it. He makes a vague reference in some of his later works to his conversion, that he was converted subito, which is immediately. We don't know why or how, and we don't even know what that conversion consisted of, other than, based on his actions, he had joined, let's say, the Reformation Party by that time. He may have been converted by some of his reading of Luther. He may have been converted by some of Erasmus's works. He may have been converted by colleagues and associates in Paris, as well as then external events that forced the issue for him. So we can't make too much of this conversion of Calvin. Um, it's important to point out, and he does reference it, as I say, this is not something that was made up that people just speculate. But again, it's a later memory. And just like Luther's discussion of his discovery in 1546, shortly before he dies, in the preface to the first edition of his Opera Omnia, his collected works, that's a lot different when you're looking back 20 years later than what occurred at the time. To keep that in mind as well for understanding and interpreting not only Luther, but Calvin too, when he only much later references this conversion subito, immediately. But whatever happened, it seemed, at least later on in his life, it was important for him. And when we look at the historical development at the time, it's almost like, thank God, Calvin, because if you hadn't, you could have been in a lot of hot water. But we'll see that just in a second when we talk about Nicholas Kopp, the rector of Paris. Nicholas Kopp was young. I mean, the title of rector of Paris, I may have mentioned this too in the past. The office of rector today is a very dignified position at universities. I think there probably are some American universities that still have the office of rector. Certainly, European universities do. When I was at Groningen in the Netherlands, the University of Groningen had a rector magnificus, who was like the chancellor or the president, the highest official. In the medieval universities, on into the 16th century, and at Paris, the rector was, let's say, an office that was the administrative office in charge of undergraduate studies, so to speak. It was usually a relatively recent master's student who had recently received their master's of arts. And so Nicholas Kopp was a contemporary of Calvin. They were friends, they were colleagues. Also, Kopp was very interested in reform and humanist reform. And as rector, he used his position to try to further that program. And he gave a speech university wide in November of 1533, criticizing the traditional curriculum, advocating for some radical changes in the university curriculum along humanist lines, and this met with grave resistance. In other words, he got himself in trouble. It would be, this obviously at the time didn't apply, but he gave a speech that was absolutely not politically correct, if that helps at all. So there's a lot of response to it in a sense of we have to get rid of these ideas, this person. This is not right, especially within that tense atmosphere. Already in the mid 1520s, the Estates General of Paris are beginning to crack down on heresy, and here we have Nicholas Kopp in the heart of the university, addressing the entire university, giving this speech. He's not talking about Luther. He's not even talking about justification by faith. He's not talking about biblical studies as such, but he's talking about how do we radically reform the university curriculum based on humanist models that also then had implications for reforming the church. That got him into trouble. So much trouble, he felt, that he had to flee. He was afraid for his safety, and he flees. Calvin remained for the time being, but it wouldn't take long. Because within the year, after the Nicholas Kopp, or the Kopp affair, almost as we can call it, there was what has become known as the affair of the placards. And the third point on that PowerPoint slide, the affair of the placards, says the straw that broke the camel's back for Francis. And this really did. It was the point of demarcation for Francis between benign neglect in terms of the religious policies to active, vigorous persecution of heresies. And that meant Protestantism, or the Lutherani, the Lutherans. That had to be stomped out. Now, what was this affair of the placards? A placard is the same as a broadsheet. It's just another term for a broadsheet, which is a one-page printing. And on the night of October 17th, between the night of October 17th and October 18th, 1534, a broadsheet was posted all over Paris and all over France. Obviously, it was a coordinated event. This is a broadsheet that, I forget how many points it has, like 36 points or something like that, criticizing the Mass, criticizing the papacy, claiming that the Mass was satanic almost. So it went very far in criticizing the two basic principles of the Catholic Church, the Mass and the papacy. Now, some of the reform circles earlier on could have been and probably were somewhat critical of the papacy, or certainly of popes. They may have even discussed, the Mass and whether it's really based on the Aristotelian physics of substance and accidents, and can we understand it in a more humanistic sense. But all of a sudden here, this was a popular piece, spread everywhere overnight, and including one of these placards was attached to the bedroom door of Francis I. Francis was in Paris at the time. Kind of a short pause in his wars with Charles V. And he wakes up on the morning of October 18th and finds this placard on his bedroom door. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back for Francis. If that um, saying means anything to any of you anymore, that was the turning point. He freaked. How dare anybody? How did this get anywhere near me? Someone very close to me must have allowed this. This cannot be. I am, as the title of the French king had been for quite a long time. Don't ask me. When was the first time that the French king was designated as the most Christian king? I don't know. But it's been for a long time. The King of France was designated as the most Christian king. And at this point, Francis said, that is then my role that I must take up and stamp out heresy. This has gone way, way too far. We are going to systematically get rid of this. So now no longer is it simply the Estates General being worried. Now France is on board as the monarch, as the king, leading it all, saying we are going to have a coordinated effort to stamp out heresy in France. It's far too far. That was the significance of the affairs of the placards. That was the significance of the turning point in France with respect to Francis between, as I said, relative toleration of what his sister was doing, benign neglect, to active persecution. That was an important point. And that was something that made Calvin very nervous. Even if Calvin did not flee with Nicholas Kopp after the affair of the placards, he realized the writing was on the wall up there with Calvin flees. And Calvin flees Paris and goes to Basel. Now, Calvin resigns his benefices. He'd started doing so sometime after his so-called conversion, later 1553, earlier during 1554, but benefices were kind of difficult because he had to travel to each place where he held a benefice. I think I mentioned this before, but maybe not. But if I didn't, I should have. If I did, this is just to remind you, a benefice was basically the means of financial aid for students at a university. It can also be for other people as well. But what it was to say, okay, part of the income of a designated parish, when you go to Mass every week, you go to Mass, it still happens in Catholic churches, it happens in Protestant churches, it happens in non-denominational churches, I assume. There's something called the collection, or the offertory, where you give money to support the work of the church. And it's always been the case. And part of the income from donations, from weekly donations, from other donations, from whatever sources of income there is for a parish, which is not necessarily negligible, part of that income would go to a scholar to support that scholar studying at the university, with the idea that they would go on to study theology, that they would come back to serve the parish as a priest and theologian. Calvin held multiple benefices, and he had to travel to each spot to officially resign and give up his benefice. So it took him a while to do so. And he had begun the process, but he had not really completed it. But he knew it was even now more urgent once he flees Paris after the affair of the placards. Now, why does he go to Basel? Basel is one of my favorite cities. I was there for about 5 weeks one summer in the early 90s. I loved Basel, even though I was staying actually in a somebody's storage closet. But they had set me up there. I mean, it was okay. There was a bed, there was a sink. That's another story altogether. But I loved Basel. Basel's a beautiful city. It's a Swiss city. It's a German-speaking city. If you know anything about Switzerland, there are three official languages of the Swiss: German, French, and Italian. Um, and this is part of the German-speaking area of Switzerland. Now it's also Swiss German, so it's Swiss German is a little bit funny. If you know German, so to speak, you can kind of understand Swiss German if you're being creative a bit. And certainly the Swiss Germans can understand German, but you have to really kind of listen to it and put it together. It's you can say, well, is it a dialect? Yes, it's a dialect. And so, like, if you speak High German, it's called High German, which developed actually based on Luther's translation of the Bible. And you go to Schwabia, Schwabian. It's a whole nother dialect. And it's kind of difficult to understand. But anyway, the whole point of this is that Calvin then went to this German city. He doesn't speak German. He doesn't understand German. Why did you go to Basel? Well, one reason is that Basel wasn't that far away uh, from Paris, relatively easy to get to. And there was Basel had already undergone a Reformation. They kicked out their bishop. They had been organizing themselves for a number of years. And the leader of the Reform movement, the Reformation movement in Basel, was a man whom I mentioned, I think, very in passing, almost not as a joke, but as just kind of a oddity in the last lecture or so. Then Johann Oecolampadius. Now, Oecolampadius was a Greek Grecization. Oh, that's a terrible word. It was a Greek form of his name, just like Melanchthon was the Greek form of Philip Schwarzerd. I do not know the un-Greek, let's say the Germanic name of Oecolampadius. I'd have to look it up. I'm sorry, I don't know it off the top of my head. He's known as Oecolampadius. He was very much a humanist reformer that had become that had gone over to the Reformation, so to speak. He was friends with Erasmus. Erasmus stayed a couple of times in Basel. He wasn't there when Calvin was there, but he had been there a few years before Calvin arrived, and he was there a few years after Calvin arrived. So Calvin viewed Basel, headed by Oecolampadius, as this perfect place to go for a humanist reformer that he was becoming, who had to flee Paris, who had then opted for the Reformation, so to speak. And by this time, um, we can start talking about the Protestants because they are protesting, not in the sense of the Protestants of Speyer, where they walk out and it's very much a protest against the emperor, but this is the opposition party to the religious policies of the King of France and to the church, therefore, as well, to Rome. And so Oecolampadius was one of these humanists that Calvin probably he may have even known. I don't know if he knew Oecolampadius beforehand. He may have, but he certainly knew of him. He knew that Erasmus had been in Basel. It's a very humanist, reform positive sense of a city for him. It makes perfect sense for him to flee to Basel, especially when it's like when you flee, you're not really necessarily thinking, now, what would be the absolute best place I should go? Let me see. Could it be there or could it be there? Let me, how long will it take? Maybe I'll pack. How much do I need to pack? You just get the hell out of there. And that's what Calvin did. And that was the first thing that came to mind. That's where he went. And that was a very good time. It was also a very lonely time for him. We'll come back to this a bit in the next lectures. It's a very lonely time for him because he did not speak German. So he could speak Latin or have to find somebody that spoke French. It was difficult. But it is in Basel that he starts working on his great work, the Institute of the Christian Religion, that he then publishes in 1536. And we'll be talking a lot more about that next week in the lectures for next week. He then, I'll just try to keep this somewhat short because I'll be coming back to talking about Calvin and Geneva, because Geneva became basically Calvin's base. He did not plan to go to Geneva, and I'll talk about that next lecture, how much he was very resistant to going to Geneva, and in some ways hated Geneva. But again, I'll be talking about that next lecture. But here, what happened is he was again continuing his journey to resign his benefices. Certainly planning on going back to Basel, which he was using as his base. Um, and he came through the city of Geneva, also a Swiss city. Now, Geneva, too, had somewhat recently kicked out their bishop and proclaimed Reformation for themselves. Not unimportant. And this was a decision of the city council, the small council. Geneva had the large council, which was all male citizens, which met once a year or so. And then the small council, of, I think it's about 35. I'd have to go back and check. Met regularly to actually govern the city. And they had voted to, they had voted for Reformation, to expel their bishop, confiscate the properties, and tried to put their own church in order. And we talk about Geneva, it's not only the city, but it's also their holdings in the countryside, so to speak, other little villages and so. So it's the core city, and you have the core city, and then around the core city is kind of the territory that Geneva controlled. And that's what we're looking at. And the reformer they had gotten to lead them and help them was a man by the name of Guillaume Farel, or William Farel, but Guillaume Farel. And Guillaume Farel had read um, Calvin's Institute. This is in 1538. Um, and I believe it's in 1538. Oh my gosh. I hope I didn't blow that. I'll come back to that next week, my next week's lecture, and correct myself if I'm wrong. 38 or 39, I believe it was. And Farel recognized Calvin. And Farel says, Calvin, you need to stay and help me reform Geneva. Calvin didn't want to. Again, I'll be talking about this next lecture. Calvin really didn't want to, but he was persuaded by the older Farel. He did. They were actually expelled in 1541 or 1540. A new city council came on. Again, I'll be talking about that next week. And then Calvin is asked back in 1541, but from 1541 on, when Calvin is persuaded to come back, Farel is gone. It's just Calvin. He becomes the reformer of Geneva. And I think next lecture is all called Calvin in Geneva or something like that. It's definitely focused on Geneva, so we'll be talking a lot more about that as well. But it's from Geneva that then Calvin really starts his program of Reformation. Now, even though he's in Geneva, which is a Swiss city, all of his policies, his theology, his pastoral care was still focused on France. And Geneva becomes the center point of almost what we call an underground railroad of Protestantism or evangelicalism, Protestantism, from Geneva into France. So France, still we have to keep in mind, is undergoing this persecution of Francis I, even though Francis is still bothered with Charles I, Fifth, and everything else. They have to hide. They have to be underground. They can't be out in the open. But yet they were smuggling pastors into Geneva. I mean, there'd be Frenchmen who would come to Geneva, flee to Geneva, study under Calvin, and then be sent back into France to evangelize and spread the gospel based on the Protestant position and Calvinist position. They would be smuggling books into France because obviously any Protestant book was banned in France, and they'd be smuggling books back into France, smuggling French Bibles into France, smuggling Calvin's works into France, smuggling Luther's works translations into France. And this was a major conduit for establishing Protestantism in France. And the importance of that we'll see later on. I'm just introducing this here now. The problem was, though, having to be underground, having to hide, irritated Calvin. And I have up there Calvin's attack on the Nicodemus. Nicodemus in Scripture was a Pharisee who comes to Jesus at night to ask him questions. He was afraid that his other Pharisees would see him talking with this suspect outcast. and that would reflect badly on him. So he went under the cover of night. And yet, we later find that Nicodemus is there at the cross. This is not Zacchaeus, but this is Nicodemus. I say that because I've often get them mixed up, the names. But Nicodemus, as a faithful disciple. Now, Calvin knew that, and it's been speculation that the Nicodemite term was actually a self-reference, that the French Protestants, the French Calvinists, because that's what they weren't really French Lutherans, they're French Calvinists, referred to themselves as Nicodemites. That may have been. It may have also been a term of derision coming from Calvin himself. In any case, Calvin wrote a couple of treatises against the Nicodemites, damning them for lacking the courage and guts to stand up for their faith and their belief. Now, just as Luther had aspects to his personality and or actions that even, let's say, the most staunch Lutheran cannot really condone, or would have to explain away in some ways. Calvin did too, with his attack on the Nicodemus is one of those. And they realized that the leader of the French Calvinists underground, Antoine Fumet, which is actually probably a pseudonym. Antoine very well maybe it's a typical French name, but Fumet is flame, fire. So it's like it's probably a reference to himself as about to be burned, because he knows he's a heretic, and if he is found out and caught, he knows he will be burned. And that's what he replies to Calvin after Calvin's first attack against the Nicodemus. He writes a letter back and says basically, screw you, Calvin. You are there safe and secure in Geneva. You fled. We stayed. We're fighting the fight under the threat of death every day. If we go out in the open, become public, what do you think will happen? We will be executed. We can't stand up. The whole movement, the whole endeavor to be killed off. That's what you're calling for. It's a very powerful rebuke. Calvin didn't take very well the rebuke any more than Luther did. And the Nicodemus continued working underground, and this underground railroad from Geneva back into France continued and was having its effect. And more of the French were converting to Calvinism. They became known, the French Protestants, which are the French Calvinists, as the Huguenots. Or there we have it, the Huguenots. Now, there's been all kinds of speculation about the origins of the term Huguenots, whether it's a reference to the Swiss, the Eidgenossen in Germany, or if it's derived from Hugh Capet, the early French king. It's really very unclear. We don't know the origins of the term the Huguenots, but they were the Huguenots, became known as I should say, the French Calvinists, the French Protestants became known as the Huguenots. And they were increasingly having an impact simply by their numbers. And it was growing and becoming a significant faction within France. Calvin was having his effect despite his attack against the Nicodemus, who refused to follow Calvin's directions and stand up and be burned. They continued working and trying to convert people, and it certainly was having its effect to the point that two princes of the blood became Calvinists. Now, what's a prince of the blood? Prince of the blood is someone within the direct line of succession. And the direct line of succession, i.e., from the king. So we have Francis I as the Valois, family of the Valois, but families, they have tentacles everywhere. And so we can start tracing lines. Certainly Francis, and then his son would become king after him, and his son or sons will become king after them. But then if there is a problem and there's a lack of an heir for whatever reason, who's next, and then it gets to this whole genealogical chart. So anyone in that genealogical chart of having some access to the throne, even if the scenario whereby that person would become king of France was rather seen as impossible, is still called princes of the blood because they have that blood in them. And we will see when we go to the wars of religion um, in the Edict of Nantes, in a later lecture, towards the end of the course, what happens at the end of the century. Um, it did come about. A Protestant, the leader of the Huguenots, actually became heir to the throne. It's a fantastic story. We'll be talking about that when we get there. But for now, um, the importance of this is that, as we saw with the Peasants' War, if you're a peasant, you have no right to rebel. You have absolutely no right to rebel. There are various theories of revolt and rebellion and revolution. One would be absolutely there's no right whatsoever to rebel against the rightful, divinely ordained monarch. The other was, yeah, but what do you do with a tyrant? And there, a radical view that was not widely accepted whatsoever is if it's a tyrant, we can revolt and rebel. That was almost non existent in the 16th century. But what was existent and debated and argued about from the 12th century anyway on was okay, but what if you're a prince of the blood? If you're a prince of the blood, can you revolt against a tyrant when you recognize that tyrant? And that was a major position to take in this debate. So basically, the ideas was either no revolt, rebellion whatsoever. It's absolutely forbidden to rebel against the established ordained monarch of God. The other was you can only do so if led by princes of the blood, princes or a prince of the blood, because the prince of the blood has the right to get rid of a tyrant because they have the same blood. It's very, I know it's very hierarchical, patriarchal, and ethnic in that sense. But the fact that there were Protestants, princes of the blood in France, all of a sudden it's like Francis, you may have tried to stamp it out, but you didn't do a very good job. In some ways, along the lines going all the way back to Diocletian, when Diocletian, uh, back in 303 CE, started what's called the Great Persecution, trying to rid the world of Christianity, but Christianity had already grown and spread far too vastly to be able to achieve that. And so after 2 years, Diocletian calls it off and then abdicates and resigns. That's that story way back then. But here, Francis, after the affair of the placards in 1534, endeavored, he wanted to stamp out heresy. He was not able to do it. And not able to do it to the extent that it just continued to grow, and also had converts who were princes of the blood. And the significance and importance of that we'll see later on, but just to show the extent to which it grew. Here's a map. Go to the next slide. Now this is from a little bit later. This is during the French Wars of Religion, which start in 1562. So this is after Calvin flees, after 20 years after Calvin is established in Geneva. Civil war breaks out in France, which I'll be talking about in one of the later lectures. But this just gives you the idea that at this point, when the French War is going to break out, you see there the purple are lands held by the Huguenots, the French Protestants. The green are held by the Crown, which is called by this time the Catholic League. It's either Paris in the north. And the yellow areas in between are disputed territories that are back and forth. And we'll come back to this map and its importance when we talk about the civil wars, the French Wars of Religion, later on. But this is, I think, important to see the extent to which Protestantism flourished and grew in France, and the problem that was for the most Christian king of France, Francis I, and his successors, whom we'll be talking about as well, because the problem did not go away. Now, what we see here is this underground Protestant movement. We see the Huguenots as a growing group, and Calvin had made his inroads and was having an effect. And all of a sudden, at some point, and I can't say exactly when, certainly by the outbreak of the Wars of Religion in 1562. But even before then, in the course of the 1550s, um, especially after the Peace of Augsburg, which you can see probably why this would be the case. Peace of Augsburg saying that the religion of the prince would be the religion of the territory within the empire. Um, in 1555, thereafter, it's like the Huguenots felt we can come out into the open. Also, we have princes of the blood leading us. So within our own territories, people can't touch us, really, even though they tried. But again, that's a story for later. But this French Protestantism had grown to the point where it could feel relatively confident to no longer be in hiding. Now, you could not go to Paris and proclaim Protestantism, preach Protestantism. You couldn't. You still had to be clandestine if you were in Catholic territories. But the growth was such that there were well established Huguenot territories. And there it was pretty much open and free. Just don't go to Paris. Now, that phrase, too, just don't go to Paris, we'll see come back later in the so called Edict, not so called, it is called the Edict of Nantes, 1598, that would settle the religious wars in France, at least for the time being. We'll talk about that, too, when we get there. But that is the extent of Calvin's influence in France. Started off being in Paris. He always looked to France, even though he is known as and seen as the reformer of Geneva, and that underground railroad, so to speak, of smuggling pastors back into France and books back into France, always looking towards France as his primary motivation, had its effect, and a huge effect it was. But it was not just in France that Calvin and his works and his ideas had an impact. It was within the Western world as such. We'll be talking about that later as well. All right, next week we have a couple more lectures to finish up the Reformation in France until we get to the religious wars, which will be a later lecture. The readings for next week, we have the prefatory letter, Calvin's prefatory letter to his Institute of the Christian Religion of 1536 to Francis I. We'll see the French focus for Calvin, and it's the same prefatory letter that was the preface for every edition and translation of Calvin's Institute. So we'll be talking more about that when we get there, the growth and development of that text over time. And then his ecclesiastical ordinances. Both are posted in the module for week 11. So again, you don't have to go to the syllabus and then cut and paste the URL that was given there. It's all right there for you, everything you need. And we'll be talking about that as we go. So, thank you very much. And the story continues next week.